Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault. I'm BurningDogFace, and last time, Death arrived at the Crowfather's realm, and found more constructs and more crows than you could shake a stick at. Now, though, we need to catch up with one of the other horsemen who is also on a mission. So, here goes. Chapter 7. It would have proved simplest and most efficient, of course, if War could simply cross over into the White City directly beside his objective. Unfortunately, the Angels, like the Charred Council and several of the other great powers of creation, were paranoid of their many enemies infiltrating through precisely such methods. They couldn't prevent him from doing so, not as the Charred Council did, but the White City boasted sufficient wards and safeguards that the entire population would be alerted to his presence if he were to so materialize. And not only aware, they'd almost certainly assume, due to his means of arrival, that his intentions were unfriendly. Whereas, if he arrived formally, they'd only suspect that his intentions were unfriendly. So he appeared from the void between realms, atop the great bridge, and moved openly towards the gates of the White City. Nor this time was he alone. The rider sat atop a horse of phenomenal size, bulging with an almost overdeveloped musculature, beneath hair of such rough gray it appeared to be granite. Indeed, perhaps it was granite in places, for the horse's lower legs and hooves were cracked like the planes of the Charred Council's abode, showing the glow of a molten core within. Gouges in the flesh along the neck and flank, shaped into runes of ancient mien, shared that fiery radiance, as did the beast's eyes and nostrils. The saddle on which War sat was as much steel as leather. The bridle, like Death's, was a chain, though this one was thick and free of blemish or rust. Patches of bridge blackened beneath the beast's hooves. It gave a guttural snort, as though in satisfaction. "Easy, Ruin." For his mount, War's voice turned as gentle as it ever got, which wasn't very. "No enemies here." Ruin's low whinny sounded disappointed. War almost chuckled. "Have no fear, there should be plenty of chaos and blood for the both of us soon enough." The span on which they trod was a gleaming gold, near enough to blind anyone who spent too long gazing down. Sweeping arches provided the bridge its support, while spouts with no natural source provided scintillating waterfalls between each arch. They flowed from the bridge itself, plummeting into depths unseen. It was musical in its way, that constant rush. Rocky outcroppings stood beside the bridge, boasting an array of knotted trees and thriving brush. Great statues of warrior angels, the stone worn and pitted by the flow of centuries, towered 3 or 4 times War's own height from a few of those crags. They made, so far as the horseman was concerned, unimpressive guardians. Grand in design, perhaps, but he would have expected a martial community to have live sentinels upon the bridge. His first sight of the city itself was not the wall, but the highest of the flying isles. These small parcels of earth floated freely overhead, not merely ignoring, but actively mocking a great many natural laws. They were jagged at the base, rather like mountains flipped upside down, and housed various fortresses and towers atop them. From this distance, War could make out few details, either of those structures or anything else. The faint shape of wings flapping around the islands might have been either angels or great birds, for all he could tell. Nor did his attention remain on those for long, for it was only moments later that the ramparts themselves hove into view. The lines and angles, windows and cannon ports, embossed emblems, and of course the gate itself, gleamed in the light, though not so brightly as the bridge. These looked more brass than gold, due to that contrast, but War knew well that they were far sturdier than either metal. The walls themselves were of some pale stone, not quite like marble, but, at least in War's personal experience, even less like anything else. These, too, were carved and inlaid into sharp panels and inset layers, so that the entire bastion was a work of art. The ramparts were too high for War to see if any guards stood atop the wall, just as the cannon ports were too narrow to expose anyone within, but he felt certain they were present. The angels might leave the bridge unwatched, but never the gate itself. The light, War could not help but notice, was purely ambient, radiating from all directions at once. Although the world was noon bright around him, he saw no sun in the sky, nor any shadows falling across the luminous roadway. It was almost uncomfortable in a way. The wall stood several dozen paces in height, the ornately sculpted barbican more than twice that. The approach should have been cloaked in the deepest shade, yet there was none. The portcullis was raised, presenting a long and seemingly empty corridor that cut straight through the impossibly thick wall. As Ruin approached, however, hooves ringing metallically on the bridge, War heard the blast of a great trumpet. Almost instantly, his path was blocked by a small phalanx of angels, all heavily armored and clutching the race's infamous halberds. Wings flapped above as other soldiers appeared from over the wall, and though he couldn't see them, War could somehow feel the barrels of a multitude of cannons gaping his way. That's more like it, then. The guard post's commander, War knew him to be the commander, as he was the only angel whose face and platinum hair were unconstrained by any helm, and who carried a great axe rather than a halberd, marched ahead of the others. He planted himself directly in Ruin's way, and War couldn't quite restrain a nod of respect. Not only did the angel handle his bardiche easily, never mind that the weapon was twice his height with a blade broader across than the warhorse's girth, but he showed no qualms about standing before a potential adversary whom he knew was far deadlier than he. The portcullis remained up, but War knew well that it could be dropped in the blink of an eye if necessary. "Horseman," the angel greeted him with a cold courtesy. "Commander." "What business has a rider of the Charred Council in the White City?" "I'm to deliver a message." Silence, then. Clearly, the answer didn't strike the angel as a likely one, not with War. Yet he had no formal standing that would allow him to question the horseman's word. "To whom?" he finally asked. "Not your concern." Again, a moment of silence. The angel seemed at a loss. Heaven and the council were not at war. The rider had offered a legitimate purpose, and he wasn't legally required to tell the gate guards who the recipient might be. So, no formal cause existed to deny him entrance. On the other hand, the presence of a horseman rarely, if ever, boded well for either the inhabitants or even the property unfortunate enough to find themselves in his vicinity. In the end, however, angels were creatures of law, and the law was clear. With an obvious reluctance that bordered on the offensive, he stepped aside and waved for his warriors to do the same. "Welcome to the White City, then, horseman. May your sojourn be fruitful and blessedly free of any unnecessary delay." War didn't even need to flick the reins, as Ruin clearly recognized the meaning in the corridor that abruptly sprouted between the armored figures. Mount and rider passed beneath the portcullis, heads held high, and it would have been difficult to say which of the two more effectively conveyed the impression that far more magnificent sights than these had, in the past, failed utterly to dazzle them. It was, for all that, an act performed for the sake of the watching angels. Not even War could gaze upon the White City and not find himself a little bit awed. The city was constructed in layers, as high as the clouds and deeper than the eye could see. Some of those layers consisted of the floating isles War had noted on his approach. Others were wholly artificial, entire neighborhoods, structures and roadways, built atop ornate pillars and graceful arches. Bridges and winding stairs connected one to another, though a few had crumbled from disuse, leaving several of the older aisles and buildings isolated from the rest. Courtyards, paved in geometric patterns, were surrounded by statues as tall as those on the bridge outside. The buildings. By oblivion, the buildings. Towers that stabbed the sky, great cathedrals as broad and as tall as small mountains, all were made up of sharp angles or elegant archways, and all were of the same stone and gold construction as the outer wall. Only trees sprouting in the courtyards and the stained glass of the many windows provided any real color to the tableau. Or rather those, and the outfits of the angels who did not wander the White City in full armor. Most of these were clad in flowing robes of deep reds and violets, though a handful wore green and a great many wore white, these last failing to stand out from the background as much as the others. Gold belts and ostentatious headdresses were common, as were slightly more subtle circlets. War found it peculiar, contemplating non-warrior angels. Angel craftsmen? Angel couriers? Angel merchants? It was difficult to picture, but then, the race had the same needs as any other, did they not? The horseman briefly found himself wondering what they used as currency, before deciding he didn't care enough to give it any real attention. Even the sounds of the city were magnificent. Where the amalgamation of labors and voices in most communities formed an ugly, cacophonic drone. The conversations of the angels and the blare of distant trumpets produced an almost orchestral tenor. Ruin marched along at a stately pace, War taking it all in, though he was careful never to be caught staring. The same could not be said of the angels. All those who passed him by on foot or on the wings stared until it seemed their eyes must burst. Most either took a couple of steps away, or made a deliberate show of not doing so, but few showed any inclination towards approaching him. Few, save the flight of 5 circling high above, who had been with him since the gate. Guards, doubtless, watching to be sure he started no trouble. Well, let them watch! It occurred to War that he must be passing all manner of establishments, workshops and warehouses, shops and homes. Yet he could see no way of telling one from another. Every structure was grand and imposing, more magnificent than temples or palaces in most other worlds. Some boasted sigils in angelic script above or near the doors, and War assumed that these were sufficient to tell the angels what they needed to know. Other than those, he could find no pattern nor any hint of what purpose any given building served. And he had plenty of time to examine them, for his route could generously be called circuitous. Even though he'd chosen the most efficient and straightforward path to the structure that the Council's agents had dubbed his objective, he would be long in reaching his objective, because the most efficient that he could manage was still not efficient at all. The angels had to transport goods and building materials, and they often played host to makers or other old ones, so the vast majority of their structures were indeed accessible by bridge and by road. For their own part, however, the angels were creatures of the air as much as the ground, and the most direct path between this building and that, this district and that, was often open sky. War and ruin, bound as they were by gravity, had to wend their way around entire neighborhoods, up and down multiple levels, for hours on end, to reach a destination that, for an angel, was only a few moments away. Finally, just as War was growing truly irritated, and the wonders of heaven had ceased to hold any appeal, he recognized the landmark for which he'd been searching. Recessed into a niche in the side of a great cathedral-like hall stood a particular statue. It, like nearly all the others, was the effigy of an angel, nearly 3 times War's height. Where most either crouched, as though kneeling to some higher power, or stood rigid in an attitude of endless vigilance, this one leaned forward, as though just beginning to swing the massive sword it clutched in both hands. Once he'd spotted that statue, he was to continue on, past the next intersecting bridge, to the first building on the right. There, if the Charred Council's informants had not deceived them, he would find Abaddon's hidden arsenal. If the spies had deceived them, well, War had no idea who the informants were, or what influence the Council held over them to command their assistance. But if he'd been lied to, the Horseman was quite prepared to spend decades tracking them down. War was now several levels deeper than the gate. The webwork of bridges and platforms above were sure to give his escorts some difficulty in keeping an eye on him, though he knew they were still above, trying their best. He was certain as well that many of the passers-by on the road were actually guards, watching over the covert installation. So although he'd much have preferred an open and comprehensive reconnaissance of his target, he settled for halting Ruin in the middle of the intersection, glancing about as though trying to remember his way. From here he could at least study his objective from the corner of his eye. Several angels grumbled as they were forced to detour around the massive beast, but none seemed inclined to challenge him directly. It was unimpressive so far as White City architecture was concerned. It was less than 200 paces across, the sweeping walls and minarets were only the height of a great castle. It was, for an angelic structure, downright humble. Its walls were of that same white stone, however, and the shuttered windows far too narrow to allow entrance. The horseman dismissed the gold-edged front door the instant he spotted it. Abaddon might not rely much on eldritch defenses, according to the spies. A high concentration of magic would be too easily detected by rival White City factions. But he'd be an utter fool if the main entrance wasn't warded by something. It could be as simple as an alarm, or a trap of flame or cannon fire, or as complex as a teleportation portal designed to transport visitors somewhere other than the building's interior. Those who had proper business doubtless had some means of deactivating the wards or some hidden entrance elsewhere in the property. Ward didn't know and hardly had the time to go searching. So if the door wasn't an option... The rider twisted in the saddle to look back at the way he had come, and his teeth gleamed in a vicious grin. Well, that will do it for Chapter 7 and this brief guided tour of a City of the Angels. Tune in next time when Death meets with the Crow Father, who had a brief though very important role in Darksiders 2. Till then, I'm BurningDogFace, and I'll see you on the next episode of Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault. Later!